Right, I'll stand up. The story goes, that's all probably heard of Marilyn Monroe. The story goes that during her brief, not terribly successful marriage to the intellectual playwright Arthur Miller, she spent a weekend, in fact slightly longer than that, staying with his family, and his mother cooked for them many of her long repertoire of Jewish dishes. But after a while, Miss Monroe became a little, how shall I say, bored by a certain dish which appeared at almost every meal. It was a soup. And she, trying to be polite and indicate her discomfort as politely as possible, she asked, "What is this delicious soup which we're having every evening and every lunchtime?" And Arthur's mother answered, "It's matzo ball soup, Marilyn." And she said, "Oh, do you ever eat any other part of the matzo?" Thank you for somebody spotting it. Anyway, the point being that there is a huge possibility of misunderstanding in every conversation that we have, and sometimes enormous. And the subject of selective state grammar schools is one which is almost totally misunderstood by almost everybody who discusses it. How do I know this? Because I've been arguing about it for many, many years with huge numbers of people, and very, very rarely does the point get across that what it actually represents is the story of a cultural revolution and of an act of destruction as great as, if not greater in impact than the dissolution of the monasteries in this country in the 16th century. A huge cultural, educational, moral, and political loss, which nobody is prepared to admit was a mistake. Almost nobody, that's to say. The people who made the mistake are largely dead. The people who continue with the mistake are very much alive and will not reconsider it. Here's the simple point. Until 1965 in this country, there were the best schools in the country were state schools. They were selective state grammar schools. You got into them not because your parents were rich or because your parents lived in an expensive area, but because you passed a very simple test. I took it myself. It would have been 1962. It was basically a verbal reasoning test and some basic mathematics just to discover whether you reached a certain level of intelligence necessary to benefit from a high quality secondary education. And if you did pass, then you went on to such a school, usually at the age of 11. There were opportunities for people to be reconsidered later on, not as many as there should have been, but there were. It wasn't totally rigid. But fundamentally, the test, although many things have been found to be wrong about it in retrospect, was designed by people who wanted specifically for it not to be a test of class. It was supposed to bypass all the prejudices of class, which is, of course, an enormous bugbear in this country, and was in those days even more of one than it is now. It was an attempt to be fair, and it was also an attempt to use the resources, the intellectual, human resources of this country properly and wisely. In fact, the Fabian Society, which was at that time still a very dominant part of the intellectual left, very strongly supported the existence and the continued existence of grammar schools, precisely for that reason, precisely because they felt that the country would prosper if it found as many of its talented people as possible from whatever class, as young as possible. Why did this matter in terms of age? It mattered because if you wait until, say, a school like the Hills Road Sixth Form College in Cambridge, an excellent school, I should say, waits until 15 or 16 and the taking of GCSEs to select your pupils, which it does, as do several other schools, sixth form colleges and others, such as the amazing Brampton Manor Academy in London, which many of you would have heard. These schools select at an age where, by and large, your chances have already been decided. If you've gone to a bad secondary school in this country, if you go to a bad secondary school in this country at the age of 11, the chances are that by the time you're 15, you will have sunk in despair in the chaos, the poor education, the repeated exposure to supply teachers who come and go, the absence of proper school leadership, the general disorder, and quite frequently the strong hostility to any signs of academic ability and diligence, which are shown in quite a lot of schools in this country. You're left to your own devices and you sink. So by 15 or 16, it's too late. At 11, it isn't and it wasn't. So one of the consequences of this was fascinating. And now the Sutton Trust, which doesn't take my political position on this at all, but does a lot of very serious research, has established that most of the best comprehensive so-called schools in this country are in fact highly socially selective and contain a much higher proportion of well-off children from expensive areas than would be justified given their status as comprehensive schools. And there's no doubt there's a great deal of social selection, whereas in 1954, a report called the Gurney-Dixon Report, which was not intended even to establish this, found that I think it's 65% of the pupils at state grammar schools in that year of 1954 had actually come from working class homes. 65%. I think you'd struggle in modern Britain to find any good school, either state or private, which could boast anything remotely approaching that figure. This wasn't the intention of the schools. The schools were never intended as an instrument of social engineering. In fact, they were handicapped in doing so by the fact that so many families wanted their children to go out to work as early as possible. So even if they were bright and passed the exams, there was pressure on them to leave early. So they weren't intended to be socially, to actually increase social mobility, but they did. And you will find in this country a very significant people such as the well-known writer and playwright Alan Bennett, whose father was a co-op butcher who attended some of the best schools in the country as a result of passing the 11 plus. The brilliant Shakespearean actor Alan Rickman likewise attended a direct grant school, a particular type of grammar school. During the 1960s, the whole nature of the two great ancient universities, this one and Oxford, was being transformed by this system, which had been introduced really in 1945 after the Second World War. What had happened was that huge numbers of people were becoming able to enter Oxford and Cambridge without any special measures, without any discrimination because of their class background, simply because they were good enough, and coming not from the expensive fee-charging so-called public schools, but coming in very large numbers from grammar schools and direct grant schools, such as the superb Manchester Grammar School, which had at that time a very large proportion of working class children as well. So this revolution continued right up until the middle 60s. And it was still, when I was at the University of York in 1970, it was still very much in evidence. Large numbers of young men and women from working class homes, grammar school children, were studying alongside me at that new university. It was quite tough to get into. And it was not, it was still continuing because the axe fell, as axes often do, quite slowly. But in 1965, the English and Welsh education authorities were pretty much instructed by the government to start getting rid of state grammar schools. And in Scotland, they were absolutely ordered to do so. So in Scotland, they vanished very quickly. And in Wales, they have now vanished totally. And in England, there are some surviving grammar schools, which are an enormous difficulty for my argument, because they don't remotely resemble the roughly 1,300 schools which used to exist then and don't exist now, because they're so heavily pressured. And someone will ask me this, I'm sure, so I'll go to it now. They're so heavily pressured and besieged by well-off parents trying to avoid paying school fees of something like £200,000 in post-tax income, that these parents do practically anything to ensure that their children pass the test against them. So there is absolutely no chance of them operating as they did before 1965 as being open to everybody who was capable of getting in. The consequences of this are hard to measure by any deliberate attempt to discover whether the new comprehensive schools which replaced them were any good. In fact, it's fairly certain that the education department, under the leadership of Anthony Crossland, who took the first action to destroy grammar schools, it's fairly certain that they did not want any such examination to take place, and it never did. But what did happen was that the actual examination system of this country, the exams that people took at school, changed very radically and very rapidly after the abolition of these schools. And it's an extremely good measure of what happened. First of all, the GCE O-level, taken at the age that the GCSE is taken now, and I can vouch for the fact, a much, much more rigorous examination than the GCSE, requiring much more in the way of knowledge, essay writing, and general performance than the GCSE does, and also with much less telescoped grades, actually had, first of all, to be hugely watered down so that its grades were weaker, more telescoped, and awarded the O-levels people who previously had failed, and then to be abolished. Then followed the A-level, which still exists in name only, but is again not remotely the examination which it was in the middle 1960s. In the middle 1960s, it was commonly said And I remember it being said among people in the education industry that a set of English A-levels were the equivalent of an American college degree. At that time, there was a phenomenon called the brain drain, under which the United States was constantly persuading British educated people, particularly scientists, to go over and live and work in the United States because they themselves, their own schools and universities, were not producing either school pupils or university students of the quality which our system was producing. None of that happens anymore. No one would say that a set of English A-levels was an equivalent to an American college degree unless they wanted to be laughed at very seriously. There is an excellent article which you can read on the net by Jenny Russell, Jenny with two N's and an I, who's not of my political persuasion, in which she examined the destruction of the examination system. And in an article, the article is called Drilled, Not Educated. And she goes through all the actual objective measures in which it's been established by university admissions tutors that the standards of the people they're taking in have been falling and falling. You will also find, and this has been particularly noticed in Scotland, but it also very much happens here, a huge inflation in university degrees. So that people are being awarded first-class degrees who 40, 50 years ago would probably not have got degrees at all. And the general grade inflation has now reached a stage where it's becoming increasingly true to say that Oxford and Cambridge will very soon be comprehensive universities rather than selective ones, particularly because of the social engineering pressure on them to give places to people from state schools rather than private schools, because they go to state schools rather than because of the quality of their minds. And this is a huge revolution. And you might say, all right, well, it's much, much lesser for all those tens of thousands of people who now have university degrees who would not have gone to university as early as the 1960s. Well, that's perfectly true. But in the same way, you could say it's much, much nicer for all those people in Zimbabwe who became multi-millionaires when the Zimbabwe dollar became so inflated that it took 2 or 3 million of them to buy a loaf of bread. The truth is that the grade inflation does not actually benefit the people who hold the certificates any more than inflated money benefits the people who hold these enormously high denomination banknotes. It doesn't actually do any good. There are two problems here. One is that large numbers of people from poorer homes are completely denied access to good education. And the second is that large numbers of people from better off homes are given access to education which is much less good than it used to be, because the old state ground schools kept the private schools honest. It was their standards, which were extremely high because of their selective nature, made it impossible for the expensive public schools to compete with them. Had the destruction of the grammar schools not taken place between 1965 and 1970, it's my guess that by now, probably between 85 and 90% of all entrants to the major universities of this country would come from state grammar schools and not from private schools. In Germany, where they still have selective state grammar schools, the private schools are negligible, unimportant, and largely despised. They're a refuge for rich people who aren't very good at their work, and they simply don't have any standing. They only continue to exist here. They were in fact saved here from what I believe would probably have been eventual decline and destruction by the destruction of the grammar schools. And there are leading figures in the private schools who've admitted this, and they're quoted in this book, which I will now wave around for you, which will be available in no leading bookshops. And none of my books are ever available in bookshops in a couple of weeks' time. But it's all there, and I can look them up if anybody wants to know. But this is a curious thing for a country to do. It's very reasonable, it seems to me, for anyone to say our education system has difficulties. Our education system undoubtedly had difficulties in 1965. It reminds me of the story which some of you must know of Evelyn Waugh and his good friend Randolph Churchill, the son of Sir Winston. Randolph Churchill wasn't a very nice man, nor I have to say was Evelyn Waugh, but news was brought to Evelyn Waugh that Randolph Churchill had been taken into hospital for an operation to remove a non-malignant tumour. And Evelyn Waugh commented how typical of the medical profession to rummage through the entire body of Randolph Churchill and find the only thing that was non-malignant and remove it. You could say, that would be a little unfair, that what was wrong with the British education system in 1965 was principally the secondary modern schools, the alternatives to the grammar schools. And that what was done in 1965 was to remove the bit that worked. And it's very curious, isn't it, if you're having an education reform, to find all the schools that are good and closed them down as a preliminary necessity for the creation of new schools whose performance nobody actually has any idea about. Nobody knew. There was no educational research which established comprehensive schools were better educationally than ground schools. And there's no wonder there's no such research, because they aren't. And there's also no research to show that they were fairer, which again is unsurprising, because in the original Circular 1065 sent out by Anthony Croston to destroy the grammar schools, it's admitted that there will be catchment area problems. That is to say, a lot of English towns and cities don't tend to be arranged in a very egalitarian fashion, and schools will reflect their neighbourhoods. And those neighbourhoods where they're better off will presumably have better schools than those neighbourhoods where people are not better off. It's not very hard to calculate, and it's well known, I have to say, in the United States, whose high schools were actually the model for British comprehensive schools. The term comprehensive school was actually invented by a man called Graham Savage, who went to the United States on behalf of what was then the Board of Education, which later became the Ministry of Education, in the 1920s, and came back with a report saying we should adopt the American high school system, which doesn't have any kind of selection variability, on the grounds that it would be more democratic. He admitted in his report, and much more later, that the quality of education would suffer. This is a complete and utter explanation of the driving force behind the whole revolution. It was a political, egalitarian revolution pursued by utopians who believed very strongly that in common schools we would end our division as a class society, and that people would all grow up together in happiness and harmony, and that it would result in a far better society. Now, it's a noble, I have to say, a very noble idea and an appealing one, and people such as Robin Pedley, who put it forward, often couch their appeals in very eloquent and moving terms. And you can see why they felt that way. And I deal at some length with the arguments for it at the time. But the truth is that since 1965, it has been shown, I think, beyond the slightest doubt, to have been a failure on its own terms. So why isn't it reversed? Why does nobody do anything to repair it? Why does the Conservative Party, every 5 or 6 years, discover that it likes grammar schools, which it didn't in practice, and say that it's going to build a few new ones? And then why does nothing happen? Why does the Labour Party make it actually illegal? It is against the law to open a new grammar school anywhere in England. Why do they do that? Why, if you raise this subject, are you immediately besieged on any social media by people claiming all kinds of untrue things about you, and also making the claim, which I constantly get, that the remaining 165 grammar schools are remotely representative of what a national system will be, because the force behind the destruction of grammar schools, the egalitarian force, isn't interested in results. It is so dogmatic that it doesn't care. Sooner or later, if you spend enough money, if you carry on doing it over and over and over again, the same thing over and over again, you will get a different result. Now, we all know what that's a definition of, but that is what they do. And the other thing is, of course, if you set out to do what I would personally prefer that this country should do as a policy, you said, right, it was a terrible mistake. We need to reinstate the state grammar schools. We need to build 2 or 3 in every major town, and more in the big cities. We probably need to build about 2,000 across the country for the population we now have. Where would you find the people to teach them? The talents, the information, the knowledge, the authority that they possessed has all been dissipated. It would be about as easy to reinstate the dissolved monasteries. It's gone. The reason why I would love to say that we could do what the people of the former East Germany did after communism collapsed there, which is they went to their local governments and they said, we want our grammar schools back, because East Germany, being a communist country, was largely comprehensive. And they've got them back. In many East German towns, there are excellent new grammar schools. I visited one in Wismar on the Baltic. Wonderful thing to go into the English class, obviously the place I was invited to, because my German's no good. And to see the children of dockers and doctors studying side by side in the same classroom, as they should be, because they're both equally capable of benefiting from the good education provided. But the problem with East Germany is that the people of East Germany are probably the least persuadable towards the idea of socialist utopianism of anybody in Europe, for the odd reason that they've experienced it. And not only experienced it, they were made to stay and endure it. They couldn't get out, even if they wanted to. They were made to stay and endure it. So they're more skeptical about it than we are. And it's a pity that. Do you really have to undergo the maximum volley of socialist determinism before you begin to wonder whether there's anything wrong with it? Well, apparently it's so. So I've written this book, and I'm giving this talk for this simple reason. Some point in your lives, you will come across a similar mistake being made, with similar majority support being urged on by the Guardian newspaper and clever people on television and no doubt stand-up comedians. Some equally stupid and destructive mistake will be put to you at some point in your lives. It will be very fashionable. Everybody will say it's fine. And if nobody stops it, it will be a disaster. It will be a disaster which will live on down the generations. This disaster has been so terrible for so many utterly vulnerable people who everybody ought to have cared about. Imagine, just imagine being a talented child with no possibility whatsoever of making use of your talent. No chance whatever. The people will say to you again, oh, the 11 plus, it was harsh, it divided people brutally from each other at the age of 11. Well, have they heard of National Offer Day in March every year, when every child in this country is divided, sheep from goats, on the pure, hard basis of wealth, and there's no coming back from it. Unless your parents win the lottery, you'll always be on one side or other of that barrier of wealth. If you're on the wrong side, you won't get no education. That's basically my point. Anybody wants to talk about it, happy to discuss it, but that's the summary of what's in the book, which I hope at least some of you will read, and I hope all of you will think about.
Well, thank you for that extremely stimulating and also concise presentation. I'm sure there are a lot of questions from the floor.
Peter.
Can I kick off? My parents came from working class backgrounds, went to grammar school, Oxford, all went to Cambridge, so for that reason, I totally agree with what you said. I went to grammar school because my parents couldn't afford to send me to private school. I've talked about England, Wales, and Scotland, but Northern Ireland kept their grammar schools. And one of my great fears about Sinn Féin, more so for blowing up buildings, is that they get rid of grammar schools. And I wanted to comment on the Northern Ireland experience.
Well, yes, it's difficult because Northern Ireland, because of its religious division, it doesn't have, I mean, for instance, the political parties in Northern Ireland don't work in the same way they do here. So you'll find people on the unionist side who might be regarded as conservative here, who would be in the Labour Party over there. The idea that getting rid of grammar schools would be an important reform in Northern Ireland never caught on because people were too busy fighting over whether Northern Ireland should remain British or not. So it was never an issue there in the way that it was on the side of the Irish Sea. So they do survive. They're much more like, it seems to me, direct grant schools of nature than they are like the British grammar schools. And also they've suffered from the devaluation of examinations in the rest of the United Kingdom. There are no special examinations in all that. They haven't kept up the old O-levels and A-levels which they used to have. So they're able, as I said, any private school is, and as any remaining grammar school is on this side of the RSC, they're able to produce what appears to be excellent results. But I'm not at all sure they really resemble the schools which existed before 1965. It's the examination system is what regulates quality. The examination system is like the Bank of England controlling inflation. If nobody's controlling inflation, or if the central authorities are inflating, then everybody will suffer from it. And I think that while it's good to see them there, and the hostility of Sinn Féin to anything always seems to me to be a recommendation for whatever it is Sinn Féin against. I'm generally in favour of, but what they haven't done is survive in the form that they were before. I think it's pretty certain, you can tell me this, that very large numbers of young men and women from Northern Ireland come over to mainland universities and find it very easy to get into them from backgrounds where they wouldn't do so in England, Wales or Scotland. because they all have access to this high quality education, and there is, by comparison with the rest. But as I say, I don't think they're getting the quality of education that they used to have before 1965.
As a matter of an anecdote, I come from a college that it'll remain nameless, but yesterday we had a meeting where the statistics were clear that we take virtually nobody from the Midlands or the North. And there was a big discussion about why this was the case. And a couple of us in the room thought, well, it's bloody obvious, but we didn't say anything because it was always sheep. But I remember as a young fellow at the college being puzzled by a particular accent. And I was thinking, is this from Scotland or Ireland? It sounded like somewhere between. It was as had come across from a number of these students from Northern. And they all had this sort of Ulster sound. It turned out that they were from the sort of Ulster grammar schools, and that I say my college with so little connection to anywhere outside the home counties, nevertheless has had a stream of students from Northern Ireland. Please.
Hello, my name is Hitchens. My question is this: I know you briefly touched upon it, and that the full destruction began in 1965 really by a Labour government, but it was really accelerated by the Mr. Thatcher in the 80s, and we've had 12, 13 years of Conservative Party rule, a party which, on the face of it, is ruled by people who support grammar schools. So why is it? I know one reckon the Conservative Party has ceased to be anything but Conservative for a very long time, but why is it that this party in particular, as opposed to the Labour Party, has done more damage to the cause of grammar schools?
Well, it's not quite true that it's done more damage, though undoubtedly has done a lot of it. I'm not here to defend the Conservative Party. Nothing could be further from my desires. I hate the Conservative Party with a passion. I long to stamp on the soles with shoes as it's flushed down the line. I've been fined. I don't know. Don't let me be clear on my issue, but the origin of the hostility towards the grammar schools did come mainly from a certain part of the Labour Party, not from all of it. For instance, Durham, County Durham, Labour Party really wanted to keep their grammar schools because they regarded them as a great achievement and a great weapon for the working class, and they were right to do so. And let's say the Fabians were in many cases sceptical about it, but there were large parts of the Labour Party increasingly dominated after the Second World War by the egalitarian left, and indeed by communist fellow travellers, and some of the most principled activists in the anti-grammar school campaign were actually communists. And this is not a secret, and nor is it particularly surprising, though it's not often mentioned. And the Conservative Party's attitude was really not particularly interested. David Eccles, who was a very clever politician, was education minister in the 1950s, saw the problem coming, but did nothing about it. There was a huge thing happened in Britain and indeed most post-war Western countries after the Second World War. In Britain, it was it's generally known now, because the American term is the baby boom. In Britain, it was known as the bulge, which I think is a better term for it in many ways. And what it meant was that in the year 1956, everybody knew that huge numbers of extra children were going to come into the secondary education system. They'd already been through the primary schools. Everybody knew that the primary schools had been bursting because they couldn't cope with it. They had many, many years of warning. And when this moment came, there weren't enough grammar schools, and there weren't enough grammar school places because the Tory government at the time had done nothing about it. And so the 11+ examination became very unpopular because many more people failed it. And people failed it who should have passed it. And at that point, the sectarian utopian concern of the Robin Pedlers and the Max Morrises meshed with a wider public feeling that the 11+ was unfair, and they began to come into political manifestos. And the Labour Party lied that they said, well, everybody can have a grammar school education. That's what comprehensives will mean, which was totally and ludicrously untrue. And the Tories did nothing to prevent it. Margaret Thatcher, when she was Education Secretary in the 1970s, didn't pursue, as Tony Crosland had in the 1960s, didn't actually pursue the destruction of grammar schools, but she didn't make any serious effort to prevent it or reverse it. But she didn't much care. Like most Tory politicians, she educated her children privately. She had very little idea of how the state system worked, and probably, unless asked, given notice the question, probably couldn't have named most of the state schools in the area where she lived. They don't know, they don't care, they don't understand. And they were useless. The real defenders of the grammar schools should have been those parts of the Labour Party which had held out for them, but they were overwhelmed. And it was very quickly over and done with. But it's not that the Tories joined in with enthusiasm, it's just they were both too lazy and too mean and too unconcerned to stop it. And all their talk later on about restoring grammar schools has been sex for one.
Because I believe in Germany, when they started bringing in Gesamtschulen, as the German term for comprehensives, they realized they were failing and they were not as good as the gymnasium. And so the parents revolted. So that's why in those regions that brought in Gesamtschulen, the failure was recognized because of
yeah, it's true. It's an interesting reflection, isn't it? Lenin said the Germans would never have a revolution because they would all wait around trying to buy platform tickets before they stormed the railway station. But actually, the Germans, and this has been true in other events recently, were a good deal better fighters than the supposedly doughty, liberty-loving British were. It's in North Rhine-Westphalia, a great social democrat area, where the attempt was made to get rid of the grammar schools, and that was where there was huge parents' revolt against them. And so they were largely. There are some government schools in Germany, but it's never went anything like as far as you can imagine.
They have replaced Shakespeare with German studies, which is a remnant of old development. But so if I've got a couple of questions here and then. So 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I actually went to one of those German grammar schools you were talking about, and you speak of myself. Like I think when coming here, I was very astonished at the level of education of my peers. Like I think I had never done a multiple choice question, exam, and then my first university exam was like way easier than anything and less required way less critical thinking than anything I had ever to do in German schools. But I think that the one thing I would say, I think that it's not enough just talking about the schools, because part of the reason the German system works is because traditionally, and sadly this is fading, it's geared towards not letting everyone go to university, because we have a very, very good apprenticeship program, which is softened because everyone now believes their kids have to go to university, because everyone believes their kids have to work in an office. It's making a lot of people very, very happy, because not everyone is happy working in an office. And if you don't honor or pay non-office jobs enough, then of course that's not attractive to do that, even if that's something you'd be much more happy doing. So I think sort of what's your input of that? Because I know there are some apprenticeship programs here, but there doesn't really seem to be an alternative in Britain from going to university. Like there is no school system. Because in Germany, if you do an apprenticeship, you work, but you also go to school. Like it's a proper education. You get a proper degree of it. You can do a master's like in the Middle Ages. So you have that old system where you can have real accomplishment and real mastery in your subject that's recognized officially. Which I don't really like. How would you have grammar schools? Or what would you do? What would you do with the kids that don't go to grammar school?
Well, very much I'd favour what you're talking about. I think apprenticeships are very important. I mean, there is a difficulty if you have grammar schools or gymnasium. There is a difficulty. What do you do with the children who don't go to them? I think Germany has problems. I think there are 3 ways you can go, but I think Germany has problems with that, but not as bad as ours. Part of our problem with apprenticeship, of course, is we don't have any industry anymore, so there's hardly anywhere to be an apprentice, which you cunningly avoided by imposing the euro on the rest of Europe, devaluing your currency, which otherwise be up there with the Swiss franc, so you couldn't export anything. And congratulations on that brilliant idea, if I may say so. I wish I'd thought of it myself. But yeah, sure, there are the attempts. There have been attempts to create apprenticeships in this country over the last 20 years, and they largely failed for many reasons. One of them being there's no real desire. There is a great snobbery about outside intellectual education in this country as opposed to practical education.
Okay, it's in Germany too. That's a problem.
Yeah.
That's why like what the problem we have, I think, is that non-grammar schools are failing, which means that grammar schools are getting pulled down to the level of.
Yeah, you will get that. And just as the other thing, of course, which I haven't mentioned in this because it's a major issue, but it's a side issue to my main argument. The expansion of universities in this country has been a catastrophe. With huge numbers of universities have been created, which are not truly universities, giving out degrees which are not truly degrees, and making people get into very serious debt for going to them, which is the thing we're going to be paying for a very long time. But again, it's an attempt to copy the American system, where everybody sort of knew the purpose of US high schools was to socialize people into becoming Americans. Education began at college. And it was one of the things, actually, which David Eccles foresaw when the comprehensive system was first being put forward seriously, now 70 years ago. He foresaw that it would involve a huge expansion and decline in quality of universities. It was one of the things which was bound to happen. As I say, it's happened now. It would involve the most enormous turning back of the clock and changing of people's minds to alter it. And the other thing about most social disasters is they recruit their victims. If you've been the victim of bad education, you're not going to want to be told that. You're going to want to believe you had a good education. And this happens in so many cases where people have been cheated by really bad policies. They become recruits to the cause, which has helped to destroy their own lives. But tragically, it is so, and many people will stand up and speak virulently in favour of the education system, which has robbed them of a proper education. There's another thing about this, by the way, which I'll chuck in here because it's important. I think that if you don't have good secondary schools, you can't have a good country. If you don't have a critical mass of people who do actually know about the past, who do know foreign languages, who do know the sciences seriously, then there is nobody there to question stupid decisions. And I would say, for instance, that in this country during the recent COVID pandemic, the almost total absence of serious opposition to so many foolish things, from the destruction of the economy and the laying of the foundations of the worst inflation for 40 years, if not worse, and very serious attacks on civil liberty, attracted almost no opposition at all because nobody knew any better. There's a brilliant book which nobody reads now, a Kingsley Amis novel, called Russian Hide and Seek, in which there's a garden party, and the sandwiches are stale, the wine tastes of petrol, the music is awful, the grass is full of weeds, but nobody notices because nobody had ever known anything better. That is a perfect metaphor for a post-education society. Now I'm pretty certain Amos, who was very furious about the destruction of grammar schools himself, I'm pretty certain that's what he was driving at in that passage. But if you don't know, then you can't be discontented. And in my view, and I pass this on as a small suggestion, it's much better to be discontented than to be contented.
There was a question back, or two, in fact, and one here. So, and it would be good, by the way, if anybody wants to challenge Mr. Hitchens, we are wanting to encourage some rational debate. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your courage. I won't be the one to challenge you today. I've recently
Do if you feel like
I've recently come from Canada to Cambridge. We're in Canada and the States. We have a pretty robust homeschool movement that is partly a reaction to how things have gone so the way they have in Canada. Do you think that in light of how weak the education system is here, that it would be worth some of us trying to bring up homeschool education to our own children, or is there another solution?
Well, I'm a great supporter of homeschooling, but the trouble is that in this country, it has in recent years become a name used to cover all kinds of other things. Many children in this country don't actually want to go to their schools because they're so horrible, and they stay at home and they're officially registered as homeschooled. Also, quite a lot of children don't go to school because they don't feel like it, and they also got mixed up in this. The actual serious, organized homeschooling that we find in North America is largely absent here. It's also a slightly hippie thing here. The organization which used to be, for one, still is the heart and soul of homeschooling in this country, called Education Otherwise, tends to be a bit of the sort of dropout time. So I don't know how you could do it. Also, it's the other thing is that for homeschooling, you have to have a parent at home, and the economic and social pressure on the parents of children in this country to go out to work and hand their children over to paid strangers about 5 minutes after they're born is huge. Who's going to do the home educating? I don't see it as very likely. I do know, I have some experience of it. Mrs. Hitchens did some of it when we lived in the USA and later when we came back here. It's very hard work if you take it seriously. And it's a lovely thing when it works, but when it goes wrong, it's not so good. So I'd be a bit pessimistic about it happening here in the way that it's happened in North America.
So one, then here, and then
This one on Zoom.
one on Zoom. Okay, I never liked the one on Zoom. Very good. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, yeah, thank you for your talk. I personally have I personally doubt that any sort of institutional change or reform will bring about a real change for the better, because, well, I'm a Korean, but I went to a private school in America, and I think I can speak a little bit better about Korea than America, because I only have a very small specimen from America. But I'm all for the differentiation between private and public schools. I'm even for the government even funding private schools, secondary or college. But one of the problems that Korea noticed is that the economic gap in the current capitalistic culture has become just so much wider than in the past, that people found a way to bring in private education to such a minute detail that if you're rich, you can basically almost gear a moderately non-intelligent 14-year-old to pass a very rigorous private school exam. And I'm not saying that all rich people are bad at all, but what I'm saying that those people who have been reared in such a home tend to have the mindset of money can solve everything sort of thing. If they go through those kind of private education and go out there into society, you will see a society that actually hasn't become a lot much better than out there. So I'm just wondering if there's any cultural aspect or value aspect that you think should chip in to your recognition.
Well, I'm not sure that we disagree. I'm not a partisan of private schools. I think there's an argument, particularly for a few exceptional boarding schools that exist, and parents are prepared to send their children to boarding schools. I wouldn't want to destroy the experience of the grammar schools. I would not want to destroy for any reason any institution which was good. So you wouldn't destroy Winchester or Eton, for instance. You would try and open them far more widely to talent from all over the country rather than just the rich. I know there is some opening, but it doesn't begin to compete with what the grammar schools used to do. I've got no particular desire to encourage private education. On the contrary, I think if we still had state grammar schools in numbers in this country, private education would not have disappeared, but would be much weaker than it is. You cannot by education alone wipe out the differences of class, nor would I necessarily want to do so, because I believe very strongly in human liberty, and I think the actions that you'd have to take to destroy all class advantage would be so radical they would make society unbearable. I lived for 2.5 years in the Soviet Union. It was the Soviet Union when I arrived, and it was the most privileged society I'd ever seen in my life. The communist elite lived in wholly secluded places. Their children went to schools which other children couldn't get into. They traveled separately. It was the most privileged, to say radically and rigidly privileged society I think I'd ever seen. And it was also deeply unfree, and they had reached the stage by an attempt to abolish inequality of all kinds, and only created a new one. So that there's a limit to how much you can do, and it's not the purpose. It was never the purpose of the grammar schools to do it. They achieved it as it were collateral anti-damage. They did something collateral which they were not expected to do, which was good. But you can't abolish privilege altogether without also abolishing liberty.
Thank you for your talk. This is a subject quite close to my heart because I went to one of those poor state schools that you described in London, and I'm hoping to rectify my lack of education here. But I recently went to a talk in Oxford given by Catherine Burwell-Singh.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And so I was just wondering if you thought that there's perhaps a glimpse of hope or a solution in her model for the current disaster that we're witnessing.
Catherine Bowles, I think she's fantastic, and we get on very well. And I've been to her school several times, and I have very mixed feelings about it. As I've said to her, I think she, I might add, is very much against ground schools. But have you met her? Do you know her?
Briefly.
Yeah, then she is a force of nature. She is. There are rare individuals who have such enormous force of personality, knowledge, determination, and moral driving forces that they can achieve things that most people can't achieve. And her school is a very moving achievement. Beyond that, it's a very moving achievement. The possibilities that she's brought to children from very poor homes in that area are huge, and I admire it. It's a different thing. I'm not sure that you could actually have many schools like that because there aren't many people like Catherine. And half the problem with state schools is that you can get, and often do get in state secondary schools, very good heads who for a few years manage to create, by again this immense force that they have, do manage to create in schools which are previously chaotic and sloppy, really good education and discipline and order in which it can take place, and then they leave. And a school which has had a great reputation for the past 5 or 6 years then suddenly plunges down because it can't be replicated. I don't think you should have a school system which depends so totally on charismatic heads. I think the schools should be themselves so institutionally good that they don't need a charismatic head to be good. They might need a charismatic head to be superb. They don't need one to be good. And I think the design of the comprehensive school means that if you don't have a charismatic head, your school will be bad. And I think that's the wrong sort of design for a Catholic school. But no, I think she's fantastic, but I just don't think that it's what she does could possibly be applied generally. I wish it could.
So the next 2 questions are from here and at the back.
Just me.
Yeah, this is indeed.
Okay, I guess to add a sort of challenging note to, I think, a point that was already raised on the question of on the question of people that don't go to grammar schools, people that, if there were grammar schools, would not go to grammar schools. And the question, I suppose, I think that raises a question maybe of like what our priorities are, because you said that the thing that you would endorse, or the policy you see is kind of problematic in its own way, would be building, was it saying like 2,000 new grammar schools?
Yes.
Which is saying that would cost.
What you'd have to do, that's what is roughly how many you need to cope with the population we have there.
So
including Scotland at that.
There'll definitely be an opportunity cost there. And it's essentially, to me, it kind of sounds a bit like showering a lot of money and effort on people who are already likely to do better in the current system than their peers. Because if you're talented and you go to a terrible school now, then that does you in. But then you're as done in as the people that go to a terrible school and wouldn't get into a grammar school. It seems like, wouldn't the effort be better expended on like helping people, like, well, essentially sort of investing in kind of vocational education or apprenticeships, like you said?
Well, there's several questions in there, and I'll try to remember what they all were. And if it drains out of my head before I finish, then remind me. Let's begin at the end. Vocational education, I'm very much in favour of. And the schools which existed, if you didn't go to a state grammar school, you would generally go to a school known as a secondary modern. And what many opponents of grammar schools say, well, yes, it's all very well saying you want grammar schools back, but do you want the secondary moderns back? As if the secondary moderns were scenes of horror and misery, which they were not. And a large part of this book is devoted to the examination of secondary modern schools, which are, in many cases, in my view, far better than the comprehensive schools which replaced them. and they were, amongst other things, smaller and therefore more orderly. They did tend to teach vocational subjects, and they often were able to transfer their brighter pupils to grammar schools to take A-levels and go to university later on. They weren't there for their first, I think their first 6 years, they were forbidden to allow their pupils to take public examinations at all, so they were completely hamstrung. And a lot of their reputation comes from that disastrous decision. It wasn't because the schools were bad, it was because they were prevented from being good. The other type of school, which you might, if you were very lucky, go to, was a technical school. There was supposed to be 3 parts, the triparts of schools. Very few of these were ever built. One of them was in my hometown, Oxford. Many were around Manchester, but otherwise you struggled to find them because there was no real incentive for local authorities to build them and keep them up. And I think they should have been built, and indeed they should be built now. But I try to keep one subject at a time. I think you underestimate the number of bright children whose lives are ruined by bad schools. I think that the need to rescue them from that is very, very strong. Not merely the injustice of it, but the stupid waste of talent in a country which seems to me, given the sort of people who now get into the cabinet, to be in serious need of talent at all levels. So there are many aspects to this thing. It's not, I don't believe in single causes for anything, or indeed single cures for all ills. I just think that in consideration of this incredibly disastrous policy mistake, anybody who knows of it will be armored against making future mistakes of the same kind.
A question back.
Thank you. So I assume my question is more of like a question on the mix of like, what should we strive towards? Like, what does it mean to have a good school, and like that the school itself is good as well for me? And I think my question also links a bit to exams, and like what, like, do you think we should have more exams, less exams in the stage of this, like of the children's development in school? And also like, because for me, I feel like why are we even talking about like having a school that then, because I know this is a small detail in your talk, but you mentioned like Oxbridge, like having a good quality in Oxbridge after, and then there's like how we select people and stuff like that. But like, why should the purpose of the school be just kind of, let's say, to go to university, or can it just be to like form a person? And then what does and then do we need exams at all, or do we use less exams or more exams?
Can I have a go at some of those? On the question of universities, I personally would like to close down a very large number of the universities. And my own university occasionally writes to me and asks for money, and I said, well, as soon as you announce plans to make it smaller, I will send you some money, but as long as you keep on making it bigger and bigger, I'm just not interested. I think we've ludicrously overexpanded the university, and people shouldn't necessarily assume that the end of their education should be university. There should be other equally honoured and useful ends, and this should be encouraged. And if they come to a place like this, then they should realise that they've been given an immense privilege, which places a huge duty on them to take full advantage of it and give back what they've been given. Examinations, I've never had much trouble with exams. Though my late brother had terrible trouble with them and found them hateful and miserable, and often did very badly in subjects which he was very good. So I'm in two minds about examinations as the best test. The German gymnasium, as far as I know, do not select by examination; they select by assessment, and I think that's a good thing. And I'm actually not by any means wholly against assessment. You can have too many examinations, but I think from time to time you have to have them. Because life is an examination. I take in my job as a journalist, I take examinations several times a week and fail several of them and pass some others. But it is actually not a bad preparation for the way in which life presents its problems to you. You need to be prepared, and you need to learn from your failures, and you need to be prepared also to have something thrown at you with limited preparation, which you have to cope with on your own, without anybody helping you. I think there's something good about that, but I'm not an examination obsessive. I think there may be people who might be wafted into universities who can't take exams at all, such as my brother was by other means. So I'm flexible on that, but I think that in general, a society which doesn't have examinations is like would be like Wimbledon, where they played tennis without a net. It wouldn't work. You can't do it.
It's not like a quality assessment for examination.
I'm sorry.
You say like we should institutionalize, like we should have all schools should be like good quality. Is that like what?
Look, I never got an A grade in examination in my life because when I was at school, A grades were unknown pretty much, except for the really clever. You didn't get them. A B in A levels was pretty good, and I was content with that. I think a lot of the grades which are given out now are actually really there for the benefit of the schools rather than for the benefit of the pupils, and I don't really care very much about them. I just want people to be educated well. And I think that if you don't have a structure of examinations, this national curriculums and all this is just flannel. Most of the curriculums never followed. It couldn't be enforced. Ofsted is just a kind of Stalinist inspectorate which goes around shouting people. Any good at all. The only real backbone or indeed skeleton of an education system must be in the form of the examinations it sets and expects people to take. I'm not necessarily that worried about the results they get, because sometimes those results can mislead, which is one of the reasons why I'm very much in favour of the interview system for universities, where you can say, well, I've got 3 people, they've all got about 19 A stars. How can I tell which is which? Because this is particularly the case at the moment, because all examinations are hugely telescoped. If you had better exams, that would be an easier task to do, but you should still interview, because at interview you can find out what people are like in a way that exams won't tell you. But I don't, what I'm really after is rigor and authority. And the whole basic motto of education, that it passes on the best that's ever been thought or said to the next generation every time. If you fail to do that, if you fail to pass on, then your civilization will decay. And good heavens, is anybody looking for a laboratory example of a decaying civilization?
On that note, and maybe a practical issue, and I only mentioned this in passing, this is a question here, but hasn't one of the big problems been recently the recruitment of teachers directly as a result of the destruction of the state grammar schools, that with the removal of elite state schools, generally speaking, that it's been much harder to keep a high quality group of teachers and to recruit them than it was in the past.
I suspect so. I think a lot of very dedicated and serious people go into teaching, and I suspect very many of them are hugely frustrated by what it turns out to be. They aren't in there actually teaching the young all the important roots and foundations of civilization. They're spending 3/4 of their time being policemen or social workers, and the rest of it trying to catch up with education. It's not to do with their talents, it's to do with the kinds of schools, as in the necessity for a charismatic head teacher, in which they teach. I know slightly a teacher who is now the headmaster of a grammar school. He strongly disapproves of grammar schools. He thinks they're very bad, but he's the head of one because at least he can get some teaching down there. He doesn't actually put these two things together, because people often don't, but it is the case. It is, if you're teaching in an orderly school, in a selective school, then you will teach better and you will get more satisfaction out of it, and your life will be pleasanter. And there's no doubt in my mind about this at all, and it just is undoubtedly the case. So yeah, the comprehensive system has been bad for teachers as well as pupils.
Yes, thank you for your talk. We've been talking mostly about state grammar schools and obviously mostly about government policy, but to what extent is this an area where there should be a role for charitable organisations and specifically the church? Because certainly in the Ulster experience, it's the very best grammar schools are Roman Catholic maintained schools, and after that, the very good ones are historically have a background in the Presbyterian Methodist or Church of Ireland. So what do you think? Maybe that's not optimistic anymore, or not realistic anymore.
Well, it's an Irish, and particularly a Northern Irish thing. It's separate and doesn't appear here, and there is a hugely complicated issue of churches and schools here, which was in fact the main preoccupation of the famous 1944 Education Act, which was the beginning of the grammar school system. I refuse to be dogmatic about this. If any organization can create a school which is open to large numbers of people who have talent but no money, then that's fine by me. I think I might balk at it being a Scientologist, but you know, there are limits. But yeah, I very much believe that the parents who teach and follow a religion at home should be able to send their children to schools which support what they say and think, rather than undermining it all the time. And that means obviously that if people want to have atheist grammar schools, then we should have them too. But let a thousand flowers bloom, as far as I'm concerned. I wouldn't want to be dogmatic about those things. It's pointless. My concern is quite straightforward, that a society which does not use its talent to the full, which throws talent on the scrap heap by an act of deliberate policy, and which reduces the quality of its education, is a society bound for the third world. And so anything can stop that. And one small thing you've reminded me, which I should mention here. There were about 150 schools called direct grant schools. There were a couple of them in Cambridge, the Peirce schools, which were simultaneously private schools taking fee-paying pupils, but also taking large numbers, I mean very large numbers of children from state primary schools at the age of 11. And they were extremely successful. And they were the perfect example of that cooperation between the private and state systems, which all politicians claim that they want. And yet, in 1960, it actually ended up in 1974, I think. They were all given the alternative: either become a comprehensive school or go wholly private. And most of them went wholly private and were closed thereafter to state school pupils. And the only reason for this was because once the 11+ examination had gone and there was no selection, there was no way of deciding who would go to them. So they were incompatible with the comprehensive system. The worst instance of this is Shirley Williams, who was Education Secretary at the time this was decided, who at that time was sending her daughter to one such school. And she stood, when her daughter was attending that school, the Dolphin and Latimer, she stood on an election manifesto forcing her own daughter's school to go private. It's so shocking and such a loss and such a disaster. And the really most spectacular example of it, of course, is Manchester Grammar School, which must be by far one of the best schools in the country, and which, when it was headed by Eric James, who was one of the most doughty campaigners to retain academic selection, he took great pride in ensuring that it had many, many pupils from the poorest areas of Manchester. It still tries, but if you haven't got the backing of the Treasury and tax money, you simply can't do it with bursaries in the way that you could do it there. And it's gone. So this incredibly good school closed to the poor by a simple down at the shutters by a stupid man called Fred Mully, who's mainly famous for falling asleep while he was sitting next to the Queen at an air display. That's an air display. He fell asleep. How did he do that?
One final question.
Thank you so much for your talk, Mr. Hitchens. It was wonderful. I hope I'm not treating you like an oracle when I ask this question. But you mentioned about the importance of giving back. And this is something that I find quite difficult in this circumstance specifically, but also just in the general culture war, if you want to call it that, because you have a very obvious war that's happening in universities and in academia. You have an edifice, as you show, that's quite lacking for schools. And even where it's not, you know, it's smaller, it's more restricted, there's not as many places to go. You talked about the fact that teachers, you know, often move around, and if they move around in certain circumstances, that can model the whole system and the way that children are taught. And so I was wondering, for those like us who very much obviously care about these issues, is it better to, you know, batten down the hatches in academia and stay rooted in institutions like this and make sure that they stay what they're meant to be? Or is it better to kind of go, you know, onto the front, if you will, and try to find a place where, you know, one can teach children as they ought to be taught and run the risk of, you know, having a disaster, you know, getting moved or think about each.
My own view is, and anybody's welcome to prove me wrong about this, my own view is that the only thing that intelligent people can do in the society in which we now find ourselves is a form of internal exile, where you live your life as far as possible according to your own principles and avoid too much engagement, particularly with politics or with the state where you can, but do as much good as you can in your immediate surroundings. I can't offer you anything better than that. A lot of the controversies which are presented to people, particularly one now, which I'm not even going to name, as far as I'm concerned, designed as elephant traps for conservatives to fall into. They're offered a provocation, and they lumber heavily towards it, and they fall into it and lie there upside down, making loud, mooing noises till the end of time, and nothing is achieved. So I don't get involved in that, and I would advise anybody else not to get involved in it either.
Well, perhaps this is the right moment to thank our illustrious, eloquent, and most thought-provoking speaker. Thank you very much again.